Hi everyone, my name is Saskia von Diest. Today I'm going to be talking to you about invoking the microbes in this age of COVID through Ecofluency. In every way that microbes are important to us, from where they are, including in ourselves and on ourselves, how they're conscious, how they're living ancestors in and on us. We also are going to talk about decolonization and indigenization. And of course, we're going to talk about COVID and coronavirus. And lastly, I'll talk about invoking the microbes through communication, through Ecofluency, as co-creators of the solutions to the challenges that we face right now. So now let me tell you a little bit about Ecofluency. Ecofluency is the science, art, and the magic of communicating with the rest of nature using an expanded spectrum of senses and awareness. Humans are nature too, so all of us can do this. Many of us have just forgotten how to use this innate ability. The great thing is that you can learn it because it's innate, because it's something that's part of our blueprint. And in fact, Anna Breitenbach talks about this in that it's supernatural. Not that it's supernatural in terms of only a few people can do it, but that it's very natural. I would even go so far as to say that it's ordinary or normal magic. It's really useful in practical co-creativity with nature. You can use Ecofluency when you're growing food, when you're building a house and you want to communicate with the land. You can use it to explore why wild, domesticated, even microbial creatures behave the way that they do. The etymology of Ecofluency is really interesting. Eco comes from the Greek word oikos, which relates to habitat or house. It's the same root of the word as economy and ecology. Fluency, on the other hand, is a Latin word, fluentum, which relates to not just being able to flow fluidly with a language, but actually means being able to be relaxed. So Ecofluency is as much about being able to communicate with nature as it is about being able to just relax in our larger home. It's being able to actually do less. The invitation is to be rather than do. So Ecofluency, as I've said, is something also of a spiritual pursuit. It's recognizing that we are our own home. We are within a larger home of our earth and of the universe. We are home. I feel really fortunate that there seems to be a growing interest in Ecofluency, and so I've started being able to work with individuals and organizations where I help them using my education, facilitation, and consultation experience of approximately 12 years to help people not just in communicating with nature on their behalf and getting information for them, but also allowing them to experience what it's like. And that's been really rewarding because my goal largely is to make sure that as many people as possible in this world recognize that actually they are practicing Ecofluency already, and just to help them do that with more awareness and to expand their ability to be able to do that. So how is Ecofluency relevant for our times? What's interesting with interspecies communication is that many people focus on animals and plants. And that's great because when you're meeting plants and animals, it's like meeting distant relatives. They're part of your family, yes. Many indigenous cultures recognize that they're brothers and sisters. Fewer people recognize microbes to be our relatives too. But because they are inside us, intimately involved with who we are and how we behave, our very existence is what we owe to them. I want to speak a little bit about microbes and Ecofluency today. And the reason for this is that meeting microbes is like meeting parts of yourself that you didn't know you had. Not just meeting family members, but actually parts of yourself on a DNA level that you didn't realize. I'm also addressing this topic because microbes have become an increasingly important and charged topic in the last year. Now, this is a really huge topic. I'm not going to be able to do justice to it, and I'm going to get a little bit of flack or criticism for even being able to address this in a broad and generalized way. I recognize that and I acknowledge it. My attempt with today's talk is to be able to just address it in a way that raises the importance of it, bring awareness to the conversation, and encourage others to start communicating with microbes. And I'll explain why that's important. But first, let me tell you more about microbes themselves. Let's start with the fact that microbes are everywhere. And when I mean that, I mean they are literally everywhere. They're on your skin, they're in your gut, they're on your hair, they're in the soil, on every tree surface, on every animal, they're on your food. They're even in the water, they're in glaciers, at the bottom of the ocean, they're on other planets and on meteorites. I've recently even learned that microbes exist in the follicles of your eyebrow hairs. Don't Google it, the images are terrifying, but it's important that you know about that, and that's actually a good thing. Recently, University of Tennessee team even found that there are fungal DNA inside the guts of newborns. And their evidence even suggests that there are fungi that exist within the placenta that get transferred from mother to fetus inside the womb. So they truly are everywhere. When I first started studying agriculture, my undergraduate degree included a module on microbiology. I'll be honest with you, I became a germaphobe for a few years, and it's taken me a very long time to recover from that. But through that process, I actually learned about how important microbes are, and I'll get a little bit into that. But I had to state this because it is the truth. Frightening and terrifying as it is, once we face the truth, it actually sets us free in a way. You can't escape microbes. They're more numerous than us, by factors of gazillions. A recent study estimated that the number of bacteria alone, so we're not even talking about fungi, protists, viruses, just the bacteria, the estimate for that is 5 million trillion. That's 5 with 30 zeros after it. And a common statistic for humans is that every human body has approximately 10 trillion human cells. The bacterial number alone is 100 trillion bacterial cells. So literally every single human being has approximately 10 times more bacterial cells than human cells. That's not even counting the fungi, the viruses, the protists, the yeasts, all of the other things. So even though there are so many bacteria around us, less than 1% of them are actually dangerous. And I'll tell you more about why they're intricately important in our body. We need bacteria, not just in our bodies. And I'm going to sidestep for a moment because I've said that they're everywhere. They are even crucial in helping trees, especially in rainforests, make rain. We don't see the microbes that exist on every leaf surface, every fruit, every fold of bark, all of the soil microbes, the mycelial network that many people are starting to become aware of through the Wood Wide Web. We don't see all of those. And actually, without them, the tree wouldn't be what it is. Equally, we wouldn't be who we are. I've mentioned that we have about 100 trillion bacteria in our bodies. Most of those exist in our gut. The bacteria that live in our gut help us digest our food. They're really important for our immune system. They're even so important that they help to produce the hormones in our gut that act as neurotransmitters throughout the rest of our bodies, which influence our mood. There's a well-known statistic about 90% of our serotonin or serotonin, depending on how you want to say it, is produced in our gut with the help of microbes. Serotonin or serotonin is the feel-good hormone, the happy hormone. For many people, this is a hormone that's severely depleted when they have depression. It can affect your sleep, it can affect your mood. They produce approximately 50% of our dopamine, which is the motivational molecule. They also help produce oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. So it really makes you wonder how important microbes are in not just your mood and your digestion and your immunity, but your state of being, how you make decisions on a daily basis. Every 20 seconds approximately, we make a new decision. How much are microbes playing a part in that, through influencing our state of mind? The biggest revelation that I had when I heard all of this is that you're never alone. I mean, we hear people joke about that when it comes to aliens. We are not alone. Well, we haven't been alone since forever, actually, because we are actually full of microbes. We're an ecosystem. Every single person is not an individual. You are a whole community. You're like a mini Earth. with loads of other creatures living on it and in it. So one thing that I'm aware of in today's world is that there are buzzwords that get thrown around. For the last, I don't know, maybe 20 years, sustainability was one of those words that got thrown around. These days, it's resilience. If we look at what makes an ecosystem resilient, you can start looking at certain factors. And there's a fantastic team with a number of researchers based in Germany who looked at this. And one of the factors, the most important factor, is health. Now, in order to have a healthy ecosystem, you need diversity. The same is true when you're looking at an ecosystem that is a farm, or whether you're looking at an ecosystem that is a human. The number of microbes, the number of species that exist in that biosphere, that ecosystem, plus the diversity of it, is what determines your resilience. So if we think of our bodies as ecosystems, you start thinking of this metaphor, like in biodynamic farming, where you think of the farm as an organism. You are actually an organism, so you are the farmer of your own farm, that is your body. It puts a responsibility on you, actually, then to start being the manager, not just the manager, but the steward, as well as the host, as well as the guardian of this biosphere, of this ecosystem that is this landscape of your body. What I really love is the fact that health, holy, and whole all come from the same Old English word of halig, which means that when you think of something as being wholesome and healthy, you're actually talking about it being complete. And so when you think of something as being holy or sacred, that's actually initially what health was about. It wasn't religion even, wasn't about being holy in terms of it being so sacred that it's removed. It meant that you were actually complete. You took the whole picture into account, and you were healing yourself on physical level, mental level, emotional level, and spiritual level. So the next topic that I want to chat with you about, the next step in this process of understanding the value of microbes in us and on us and around us, is their role as living ancestors and family inside us. So you inherit genes from your parents through vertical gene transfer, but we also inherit microbes. And by inheriting microbes, you are actually carrying the lineage of those microbes, not just from your parents, but from your great-grandparents. Specifically through your mother's line, more than maybe your father's line, because, and this is where it gets really interesting, at birth, which in itself is a messy gateway and rite of passage on many levels and for many reasons, you have this rush of microbes that coat your body inside and outside that you inherit from your mother. So a large part of our body's colonization by microbes happens at birth. That sets the foundation, which also means that your health, and I talked about diversity as being crucial to health and therefore to resilience and therefore to immunity, which we'll get into a little bit later, is actually tied to the resilience and the health of your mother's microbial biosphere. How healthy she was at the time of your birth and during pregnancy will determine how healthy you are going to be at the starting point for the rest of your life. What's also really interesting is that we inherit DNA from our microbes. So we don't just inherit the microbes from our parents, but they actually are drivers of our genetic evolution. So I talked about vertical gene transfer, where you can inherit genes from your mother and your father. But through horizontal gene transfer, you inherit DNA from the microbes that live inside you, on you, and around you, including the ones that you get from food to a degree, and the ones that you get from touching all the surfaces. Remember, microbes are everywhere. There are many, and that's actually a good thing. Because the human genome has about 20,000 genes. The microbiome, meaning the total number of microbes that exist in and on and around your body, have about 2 to 20 million genes. Not only are they 10 times the number of cells in and on our body, but they have even far more than that, the number of genes than us. And what's really cool is that they actually transfer bits of their DNA to us, and we incorporate that into our own genome, which means that without them, we wouldn't be who we are. In fact, we even evolved from microbes and through them. The mitochondria, which are organelles inside of a human cell, and inside of many cells actually, all eukaryotes, which are beings that have a nucleus inside their cell. Many of them have mitochondria. Mitochondria are like the power stations, the energy houses inside of our cells. They help us to use oxygen and to make energy in our body. They evolved from bacteria. So the fact that we can breathe and that we can live and make energy in our bodies, we owe to those microbes. So the next thing that I want to chat with you guys about is how microbes are conscious. Before I get into that a little bit more, I'll first give you some examples of how I've experienced them and how others have experienced microbes of being conscious. A few years ago, I started experiencing flu symptoms. Now, when I get ill, because I've been quite ill in the past, I thought, oh gosh, okay, flu symptoms are starting. I can basically cancel the next 2 to 3 weeks and I'm going to get a sore body and headaches and sniffly nose and the whole works. And then I realized, okay, I've communicated with plants and animals and water and all kinds of creatures in the past, even fungi. But I hadn't communicated with the virus, and not one inside my body yet. So I sat down and I decided to start tuning into the virus in my body. And I explained to the virus that I acknowledged that it was an inevitable and useful part of my ecosystem. And I thanked it for its presence and whatever it was there to bring me. And I just said to it, look, now's not a good time to get symptoms. Do you think we could just hold out for a little while? And I basically negotiated and said, if you guys can hold out on the symptoms, then I will not do anything that tries to harm you. Not that we technically can do very much against a flu virus, but it helped. I don't know whether it was that or whether it was something else. Maybe it was just coincidence, but my flu symptoms disappeared within about 20 minutes. It's not happened every single time I've done that, because largely it depends on your state of mind, how well you can negotiate, what you bring into the communication. It's the same like communicating with another human. Just because you ask them to do something doesn't mean that they're going to do it. But if you can communicate in a way that is authentic, that is mutually beneficial, with good reason, often it's successful. Another example is a Dutch farmer that I interviewed during my postdoctoral research. This particular farmer wasn't using any synthetic chemicals, so he was either organic or biodynamic, I can't remember right now. And he had, one of the things that he grew on his farm were potatoes. And in one of his potato fields, he suddenly got a massive infestation of Phytophthora. Phytophthora infestans is a fungal type of organism. It's not technically a fungus, it's an oomycete. So it looks and behaves like a fungus, but it's actually a soil-borne organism that is carried through water, through the soil, and causes late blight. So late blight is the disease that caused the Irish potato famine and affected so many populations in Europe, but specifically with the Irish, and actually caused a mass migration of the Irish towards America. So if you want to think of microbes as being particularly important, they've even affected how we migrate across the world. They've affected our history. So back to this farmer. This particular farmer decided he was going to communicate with the fungus, the oomycete, the fungus-like organism that is Phytophthora, and find out if there's some way that he could find a negotiation or find a way of working with this fungus as a way of working with nature that meant that it was mutually beneficial. So this Dutch farmer had a conversation. In the same way that I said to the flu virus, yes, you're an acknowledged part of this ecosystem. We value your presence. You are as welcome as all the other creatures. You have as much of a right to be here as any one of us do. He said to the Phytophthora, look, the potatoes that I'm growing are actually for the humans, but I recognize that they are also your food. how about we come to some kind of an agreement? How about I plant a certain number of potato plants under that tree over there in the corner of the field? And I won't explain now how the fungus or the Phytophthora knew which particular tree and where. There are ways in which you can use this in communication and be clear. But the point is that he basically said to the Phytophthora, if you can stick to those plants over there in the next season, I won't harvest them. That will just be your place to live. So I will provide food for you on the condition that you leave the rest of the field alone, so that I can actually harvest these potatoes, which when you are here is really difficult to do, to get a good enough crop to feed the humans. And by doing that, we can both benefit. How does that sound? He believed that he got an agreement in this so-called eco-treaty. I use the word eco-treaty because there are some amazing plant communicators in the US. I think they live in Vermont, Jim Conroy and Basia Alexander. They started tree whispering, I think it's called. Check their work out. That's a great way of trying to negotiate with the other than human, especially in agricultural ecosystems. So the long and the short of it is that the next season, the incidence of Phytophthora in this farmer's field went from something ridiculously high, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something like 95 or 99%. It went down to something that was as low as maybe a few percent. Whereas the plants that were in the corner of the field, next to the tree he had described, that became the Phytophthора's house. I didn't get a chance to interview him in subsequent years, but I believe that that was one example of how a farmer was able to successfully work with nature, meaning the fungus, because that's also nature, and actually come to a way of working that was more harmonious and more authentic, recognizing the right of every organism, of all the microbes, to exist on this planet. So now I'm going to chat a little bit about the consciousness of microbes. I won't go into what consciousness is or how you can prove it. I won't even go into how you can look at how microbes are conscious. Partly because this word consciousness, and when I use that word, I describe it as being awareness. Just let's keep it to as simple as that. Microbes are aware. They're also self-conscious. And I'm not the only person that would describe it. There are a small but growing number of scientists, modern Western scientists, who would agree with me. The reason I'm not going into this word of consciousness is because it's a minefield. The modern Western scientific method is about 400 years old, the way that we know it. It's not found any methods yet that would be able to prove exactly what consciousness is. What I will say is that it's seeming more and more as though it's non-local, meaning it's not purely produced by the brain, it's not only in our brain, there's a mind that extends beyond our brain. And you don't even have to have a brain in order to be conscious. So trees can be conscious, grass and soil can be conscious, microbes can be conscious. I would recommend checking out the work of Dr. Siobhan or Siv Watkins. She has a fantastic website called Microanimism. Animism is this idea that everything is conscious. And it's something that's pervasive throughout many indigenous cultures worldwide. It's something that many European pagan traditions would also have agreed with. And microanimism is this idea that even microbes are conscious. So not only are they conscious, but it also means that in some way you can also communicate with them. Like I described how I did with the flu virus, like how the Dutch farmer described communicating with the Phytophthora, which is a fungal-like organism. There are many other examples that I could give, but that's something that you can read about in my work on the Ecofluency website, and you'll start hearing more and more about this. Another great example is animal communicator Penelope Smith. On her website, Animal Talk, she's got a blog post where she describes how, I think she posted it last year in January, where she describes how viruses are sentient and how that they carry messages that are important to humanity, how you can tune into them. An important thing to remember, which is something that I've come across and these other people like Dr. Watkins have come across, is that even though microbes are conscious, when you communicate with them, they're morally neutral. So it's not like you have a virus or a tapeworm living inside a guy thinking, oh, I hate this guy, I'm going to kill him by eating him from the inside out. No, they don't do that. They're just going about their business. They're eating, pooping, mating, moving around, doing the microbe thing, like many creatures. They're existing. Yes, they compete. Competition is actually really crucial, not just among microbes, but amongst humans, amongst all of the ecosystem. It's part of our evolutionary process. They also cooperate, but depending on whether they compete or whether they cooperate, it really depends on what's necessary for them, for their survival at that point in time. This idea of microbial cooperation and competition is something that's being looked at by Professor Kevin Foster, who's an evolutionary biologist who's been looking more into how microbes are cooperative and competitive. I highly recommend checking out some of his videos on YouTube. So yes, microbes seem to be morally neutral. It's us that place judgment on whether or not they're beneficial or harmful to us, based on whether they're useful to us or not. If they cause you harm, it's not personal. They don't hate you. It's just them trying to survive. That being said, they can cooperate with other beings, other forces, other intelligences in this universe for certain purposes. Like, for example, being a messenger or carrying a message, or even rocking up in your world in order to bring some kind of a message. Their very presence can be indicative of something that is almost nothing to do with the microbe itself. So this is the next point that I want to make, is that microbes can be messengers. So when an ecosystem, whether it's a human body or whether it's a farm or whether it's a nature reserve, is in balance, you have great diversity of microbes of all species in there. When that system stops to be as healthy and as vibrant and resilient, then certain creatures start to become more in number. They start to outcompete other creatures. And this can be, for example, when your immune system is low, all of a sudden the flu virus, for example, in your body starts increasing in number. It takes advantage of the fact that something's out of balance. There's a slight weakness of some kind. When something is out of balance, that's when disease happens. And that's exactly it. It's not just an illness, it's dis-ease, a lack of ease, a lack of harmony, a lack of vibrancy, a lack of health. So a microbial presence, for example, can indicate that there's something out of balance. Think of it as not just the symptoms that they create, but their very presence is a symptom, which could mean that it indicates a lack of a specific kind of nutrient, for example, in the body or in the soil. So when you speak about disease, of course, you have to bring immunity into the conversation. And when you bring in immunity and disease, you also have to bring in what causes them. So I studied plant pathology while I was at university. And one of the things that we learned about was germ theory. And in germ theory, a pathogen causes disease, meaning it's a disease-causing organism of some kind. And the idea is that if you wipe out the pathogen, you wipe out the disease. It's not entirely untrue, but it's an incomplete picture of how disease happens. The problem with it is that it's not taking in the whole picture, meaning it's not a holistic approach to health and to disease. Unfortunately, it's typical of modern Western science, which takes a reductionist approach to most things, really. And as we can see today, we've identified that certain pathogens or viruses cause certain diseases, and we'll get to that more later. But attempting to wipe out a microbe doesn't always work. They're evolutionarily brilliant. As I've said, we've even evolved from and with microbes. For instance, bacteria use biofilms. A biofilm is something that is not just the bacteria themselves, but the film or the matrix that they create by excreting or secreting certain substances. Like, for example, when you get ill and you get phlegm at the back of your throat, that's a biofilm. Biofilms use this, for example, to avoid being attacked more easily. They use biofilms also, plus something called quorum sensing, to avoid being detected even. So even if you were to use an antibiotic, for example, it might be that it can't even get to the bacteria because they've created like a shield around themselves, using things that they secrete or excrete. Bacteria and fungi can also evolve really quickly, sometimes even quicker than certain antibiotics, meaning antibiotics are things that kill life. So when you talk about antibiotics, you're not just talking about the things that kill bacteria, you're also talking about antifungals or insecticides. Those are also antibiotics. The point is that bacteria and fungi and insects, although they're not microbes, but they can evolve sometimes quicker than antibiotics are being developed. So then you get resistance forming. Resistance to antibiotics is something that's really prevalent in our world today. For example, many farmers in industrial agriculture use antibiotics far too often, especially farming with animals. And that antibiotic resistance has started crossing over from the animals into the human systems. Viruses are also really good at mutating at a rapid rate, which means that even vaccines can start to become useless to certain strains on a regular basis. And you can see where I'm going with this. Even if you can wipe out a microbe, the particular microbe in question, or all of them, there's the danger of successional populations. So when you create a void or a gap in any ecosystem, something else is going to take advantage of that gap and swoop in an opportunistic fashion. For example, in agriculture, soil fumigation was used for decades. They would use something like methane gas to fumigate a soil and wipe it clean so that it was sterile. And the idea was, if the soil is sterile, then you can manage it better. You can see where I'm going with this. Even if it's a closed system, like in a greenhouse, that's not to say that it's a perfect idea, because you get successional populations through the water that you use in the irrigation, through the air, through people walking in and out of the greenhouse carrying soil on their boots. If you're starting to make something sterile, you have to make sure that you are completely in a sealed environment, which is not great, because as we realize, microbes are everywhere, and it starts to become a really expensive job, but also one that becomes unhealthy because it's not taking into account the whole picture of how ecosystems work. So when you start to wipe out certain microbes in an ecosystem, whether it's one, whether it's a few, or whether it's many, you start to create gaps that create imbalance, which creates further disease. And then the path back to wellness and to health and to wholeness becomes a much longer one. In terrain theory, the idea of disease means that it's a symptom of this wider systemic imbalance, whether it's internal or whether it's external. And there's a common analogy, which is really, or metaphor, it's really oversimplified, but I'm going to use it anyway because it illustrates the example. If you have a goldfish inside a tank and the goldfish gets ill, in germ theory, typically, you would say, okay, there's something wrong with the goldfish or with the water. You're going to put chlorine in the water, or you're going to give something like an antibiotic to the goldfish to make it better. In terrain theory, the idea is, why is the goldfish getting ill in the first place? Clean the tank, give it healthier food, give it fresh water on a regular basis. That's how you make sure that it doesn't even get ill in the first place. It doesn't even need to have antibiotics thrown at it. So now the next question I can hear you screaming is, what are the microbes trying to tell us when we get ill? The simple answer to that is, I can't say. It's going to be situation dependent. If we're going to use a blanket approach, again, it's not going to take the whole picture into account. Because if we're going to use a reductionist approach, it means that we're going to try and look for an answer in one specific situation and then think that it applies to all other situations. Not a great idea. Every single person is different. Each one of our ecosystems is different. Each farm is different. So it could be that a particular microbe is giving you a message in your body, in your instance, and it might be different depending on different points in your life. It might be that you and a sibling get slightly different messages from the same microbe. The same could be true for different families, different populations, different demographics, different countries. A talk that I recently heard by Nicholas Salazar-Sutil. He talks about when you're sick, it's because you're lacking a particular piece of wisdom. In order to restore you to health, it's restoring you to wisdom. When that happens, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily skipping a lesson. It doesn't mean that just because you're getting ill, it's because you've done something wrong or because you've missed something. It could be that it's because of a much larger context. And this is now where it starts coming into the spiritual realm, because healing is as much a spiritual process as it is a mental, physical, and emotional one. For example, karma, in my mind, doesn't happen in a straightforward way. neither do past lives, neither do our ancestral woundings. And when microbes appear in our life, it could be that actually they're bringing a message from something that we need to look at in a different way. Now, there are many ways you can do this, and I won't go into this now, but the benefit of using communication, for example, is that you can actually ask the microbe directly, what is your message? Can you lead me to what it is you want to tell me? They start becoming co-creators in the solution as well as being messengers. When we think about colonization and decolonization, it might be, trigger alert, helpful to think about the fact that every single one of us has actually been involved in colonization and decolonization. And the reason I say that is because we tend to think of colonization in a human context. But actually, all of us, because we are so enmeshed in the microbial realm, all of us carry microbes around with us. If you go on holiday somewhere, you are moving microbes around. You could be unwittingly responsible for microbes moving around and colonizing and possibly causing havoc. Of course, in this day and age, with the current topics going on around coronavirus, many people are aware of that. But it happened way before that too. We've been doing it our entire lives. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. As I've mentioned, it's inevitable. You can't escape microbes. They're everywhere anyway. The same is true for decolonization. As I described with germ theory and terrain theory, if we start applying germ theory to the idea of colonization, it means that we're starting to try to wipe out certain microbes and try to wipe out that which came before. But maybe a more helpful way would be to bring this idea of indigenization as part of the conversation, meaning colonization happened, it's undeniable, and actually, on whatever level you want to describe it, it's been a part of our evolution. And so to bring in the idea of indigenization could mean that actually that is also going to be a part of our evolution. Meaning anything that we are bringing in, whether it's cultures, whether it's microbes, that could not just be replacing a finite number of things, whether it's things like food and culture and beliefs and microbes, but it's also enhancing it. And this is part of our ongoing co-evolution with the microbes. So one thing that we might want to ask ourselves is actually, what is the difference between colonization and indigenization? I can't say that I'm going to answer this in a very complete way, but I can speak to it maybe from my perspective, from my experience and my knowledge of how microbes behave, and my experience personally of moving from a different country, from the fact that both my parents actually came from different cultures. And I was born in South Africa and I moved to Britain and I now live here. In colonization, very often you are taking what you have and you're bringing it to a new place. You are competing with those that are currently there for resources. You are bringing your culture, you're bringing your language, you're bringing your way of being into a new place. Now, when a microbe colonizes, it not only goes into a space, uses resources, but it does also indigenize, because through quorum sensing, it communicates with the local microbes of that area and either competes and or cooperates to become more effective in living there. So this is where the balance between colonization and indigenization could be taken from a microbial perspective and actually used on a human scale. Yes, many of us are the products of colonization. That cannot be ignored. But how we respond from this point forward as a collective is going to be really important. And maybe we need to take a lesson from the microbes in bringing conscious awareness to a different layer, to all the different layers of our being, meaning from an indigenization process and recognizing the fact that we are not just the products, but the result, the fruit, if one wants to think of it in a more beautiful fashion, in a non-mechanical sense. You are the fruit of colonization. Going forward, what are the seeds that you want to sow in your own life, in your children's lives? And if you choose not to have children, in the children of the community around you, what is the change that you want to be in the world? And the indigenization process might actually be really helpful in that regard. in the ways that I've mentioned. Start to recognize that wherever you are, there you are, plus so are all the microbes. And maybe there's a role that communicating with them could have. The same is true when you're starting to look at the microbes that enter into your space, that you start thinking of as colonizing your space. So when chatting a little bit about this idea of colonization versus indigenization, we could start thinking, well, where do you draw the line in that balance? Well, to give you the example from my own life, I moved here from South Africa. So it doesn't mean that in my own indigenization process, I just become everything that is British. I'm still South African. I still have the accent. I still like certain food. I still love the music from South Africa, and certain things of the culture, I miss it. I can bring certain things of myself and of my culture to this new place, as well as enmesh myself in this current culture and weave what I've taken from where I come from into this new way of being. And in so doing, it starts to cross-pollinate. Maybe there's a horizontal gene transfer that happens between myself and the microbes that happens in this area, and from the microbes of this area in myself. So it means that there's a harmony that happens. And this is the point I want to leave you with for this piece, is that indigenization doesn't deny colonization. It just means that there's a balance in our give and our take. What is the tune that you want to add to the song, to the symphony of the surrounding environment where you are? Whether you're moving through it temporarily or whether you choose to stay there on an ongoing basis. Finding harmonious ways of being, that's what I'm aiming to do with Ecofluency, and that's what I'd love to see more people doing. Many people already are. And thank you so much for doing that. Let's see more people do that. So the next topic that I want to chat about is the role that microbes play in this current, contemporary, charged topic of decolonization, and possibly also indigenization. So one thing I learned while studying plant pathology is that microbes colonize. It's just something that they do. And like I mentioned, they cooperate and they compete with each other. And when they colonize, they're taking up space because that's what they need to do. They compete with each other for resources, but that also means that they start to improve. They start to develop certain evolutionary practices that mean that they're better able to survive. If you start looking at even human colonization, it makes you wonder actually how we value colonization. For millennia, humans used to move around as a matter of course. You know, whether we were hunter-gatherers, whether we became agrarian, we moved around to colonize, meaning to find a better place so that we were able to survive. Of course, colonization has caused a lot of harm. When you colonize, you kill. You can cause a lot of damage to a place, also ecologically. But again, it depends on what value we place on it. If we start zooming out from it, we can start actually looking at colonization in a different way. When we speak about colonization in the modern world, many humans start thinking about how many European nations in the last few hundred years colonized other parts of the world. But we're taking that out of context in the larger arc of time and evolution of humanity. If we think about colonization, we actually have to start going way back. And that doesn't just mean European colonization, because yes, absolutely, Europe itself was colonized from various other nations throughout the ages, but it happened elsewhere as well. Look at what happened with the Mongolian Empire in the 13th and 14th century. They colonized large parts of China. Even if we think about where we are now in Britain, that's been at the hands of colonization for a long time. And I'm not going to use the word victim necessarily, because yes, many people were victims of colonization, but that's also just in our human nature as well as it is in microbial nature to expand, to look for resources. If we think about it in terms of a natural balance between competition and cooperation, then you start understanding the way we behave in a different context. Britain was colonized by the Danish, by the Vikings, by the Normans, by the Anglo-Saxons. And if you go further back, even before the Roman Empire to even before the time of the Celts, we had colonization in Britain. In South Africa, where I'm from, as you can hear from my accent, you've got colonization that goes back to before the time that the Europeans arrived. You had the Bantu tribes that came from further up north in Africa, down to the lands where the Khoisan, or the Bushmen, which were hunter-gatherers, and where they were roaming around. And the Bantu tribes colonized much of South Africa before the Europeans arrived. So it depends on what you want to define as what is colonization and the impacts of it. We can't undo colonization. That's like trying to say we want to unmake our history. And there's so many benefits that have come from colonization as well. Many of us are the results, actually, of colonization. Maybe it would be more helpful to start thinking about indigenization. By that, I mean, wherever you are, there you are. And that refers to the fact that our ancestors came from many different countries and moved around before we think about colonization a few hundred years ago. My ancestors came from all over Europe, all over Asia. And I wouldn't be here today if they didn't do that, if they didn't move around in the way that they did. But wherever they moved to, they became a part of that place. So indigenization refers to this process of starting to belong to wherever you are. If we think of it in that context, it starts becoming an act of eco-socio-cultural repair on many levels. Now, I know that when we think about being indigenous, many of us refer to people that are First Nations people, Native American people in North America and in Middle America, many of the Amazonian tribes, many of the tribes like the Sami in northern Scandinavia. Yes, they are absolutely indigenous, but you can become indigenous to wherever you are. So this process of indigenization doesn't mean that you are just becoming indigenous to the place where you are on this earth. It's remembering that you are of this earth. You already belong to her. You are one of her children, if you want to think of her as being our great mother, our greatest relative, our oldest relative actually, apart from the microbes. Which means that it's remembering that you are already indigenous to this planet. Now, when you think of it on the human scale level, going back for millennia, the practice of passing around a pipe or a ceremonial cup or horn, breaking bread, sharing food, that was something that was often practiced in communities. When you were a newcomer to an area and you joined in those processes, you were also sharing not just in the communal spirit, but you were actually sharing microbes as well. That was a part of you becoming embedded in microbes in the community, becoming a part of it. And as we described before, how microbes are actually really part, not just of them becoming a part of our ecosystem, but becoming a part of our DNA. You started becoming on a very deep level a part of that community. Sharing microbes is so intricately linked to community embodiment, let alone personal embodiment, and grounding in a particular place. So the point I'm trying to make with this is that microbes can help us to belong. They could help in the indigenization process. These days, when you move to a different country, there's a naturalization process that takes place. You're expected to learn the language, the history, the politics, the culture of a particular area. You might even have to pass a test before you're given the right to remain there, given a passport. And microbes can help in that process. The reason I'm saying that is because as part of that naturalization process, in learning the language, you're having to communicate on many levels with that local community. Everything is in relationship with everything else. We're all in relationship with microbes, every single one of us, in ways that many of us hadn't even realized. Maybe today's talk has helped you to realize it in some ways, but there are other ways that I don't even know about, that we don't yet know about. Less than 0.1% actually of all the microbes on Earth have been discovered. So we don't even know how deeply embedded and microbed we actually are on all different levels. So clearly, with such an intimate relationship, it's time that we start communicating with microbes. Partly because they are family, they're our ancestors, and they hold solutions that we might not even be aware of. Not only to becoming indigenous, to recognizing, to remembering our indigenization on this planet and in the place where you are on the planet, but also to the current challenges that we face. So now moving on to this topic, finally, of COVID and coronavirus. The first thing that I want to say is that there's a reason why I focused on the entire microbiome, why I've made the point that they're everywhere, They're very numerous. That's a good thing. They're our ancestors. They're conscious. You can communicate with them. They've been part of our evolution. They have been part of our colonization, as well as can be part of our indigenization. They are part of our indigenization. And we've been trained to think that viruses are all bad, or many of them are bad. Especially now, we start becoming so hyper aware of that it can actually be damaging to how we relate, not just with viruses, but also with each other. It doesn't help to start pitting ourselves against nature, because we are nature, viruses are nature. It's like pitting ourselves against ourselves. And when has that ever been helpful? So, there are a number of theories about what causes COVID, the disease. Whatever the cause, if we focus on coronavirus, then we can start to look at what is the message that this particular microbe has for us. And now, of course, it's going to be different on an individual level compared to a collective level. Like I said earlier, a certain microbe might have a different message for one individual compared to another. But let's focus on the collective message right now. This isn't just an individual illness. We're living in a pandemic era, meaning that what COVID and what coronavirus and what this time is bringing to light is pandemics on multiple levels. And it's happening in ways that people are only now starting to become aware of. The message seems to be that we need to be changing our thinking in every system. What's happening is systemic, not just to do with our immune system, not just to do with our social systems, but to do with the fact that on every level, there are certain movements, certain spheres of life where something could be changed. COVID has brought to light many movements, both throughout and alongside it, that make us start to question what is actually going on. I'm going to list a few of these, and I'm just warning you to brace yourself because there are many. Some of the tension points, issues, challenges, systemic problems that coronavirus and COVID have brought to light are BLM, gender equality, social disconnect, economic inequality, the destabilization of many currencies, and the rise of cryptocurrencies, political extremism and the polarization of it in all directions, corruption, the justice crisis and the overflowing of prisons, Brexit and trade deals, industrial agriculture, genetic modification, including of humans, the rise in health problems in all spheres, before even coronavirus came to light, globalization and environmental degradation, microplastics in the ocean, overfishing, the destruction of the soils and the microbiome within the soils, mass extinction, ecocide, climate change, melting of ice caps. The list goes on. COVID has glossed over many of these, but it's not a coincidence that these are all coming to a head at this point in time. And it's not just because our awareness is on them. Things are peaking for many reasons. Let's just stop for a second and actually take a breath, because this is an overwhelming list. And I can feel the anxiety and the grief in me rising as a result of this, which is another thing that started to peak in this time, is the collective grief of what's happening. Not just because of the deaths that have been associated with COVID, but also because of the grief of what's come before. This is making us think back to maybe it's past lives if you believe in them, maybe it's ancestral lineage problems, maybe it's karmic, maybe it's whatever the reason, your own childhood trauma. This is all coming to a head right now. Yes, we're at a crunch point. And this is the most important point in time for humanity's evolution to date. The problems are systemic, but that means that the solutions need to be systemic too. Now, that doesn't mean that everything can be achieved on an individual level, but yet it needs all of us, every single individual, to take part in finding the solutions. And it doesn't mean that each individual has to face every single problem, but it does mean that all of us need to be aware of the systemic problems, recognize where that role is within us and also our role within the problem, and start to make steps, because every single step counts. As each of us make a difference, we start to have a domino effect. And like that story of the 100 monkeys, we will reach a tipping point where it soon starts to become a systemic solution, and systemic change comes about. Curing individuals using our current health approach is not going to solve our problem. Do you remember successional populations? Trying to wipe out one virus and even other versions of it as it mutates is just going to create gaps. It's going to create imbalance in our own ecosystem and in the wider ecosystem, because it's going to change our behavior in ways that we cannot predict the outcomes of. This is a huge and multifaceted challenge, of course, but it also means that there's an opportunity. Do you remember when I told you about how the microbes are in us? We carry their lineages. Well, through the idea of epigenetics, they also carry our ancestral memories. Microbes are brilliant at evolution, which means that they could be really involved in the solution. Think of each one of these microbes as teeny tiny companions, little personal guardians on you. You're never truly alone, even though we feel alone because we've been isolated, because we've been forced to increase our social disconnect. It doesn't mean that we truly are alone. You have 100 trillion microbes, approximately, or at least, since we don't even know about all the microbes that exist. You have an entire ecosystem to back you up. Microbes could teach us quite a lot about how we relate and how we treat each other as humans. If we look at how we relate, it starts to impact every sphere of our world and of our lives, from medicine to education to social governance systems, to political governance systems, economic. It affects how we grow food, how we transport our food, how we manage the soils. And of course, since we're learning, it's going to teach us how we educate ourselves and future generations. And I'm going to say this again, fundamentally, because healing is a spiritual process as well, it could be that microbes have something to teach us on a spiritual level too. In this age of Aquarius that we've just entered, it's easy to look up and to look inwards towards the gods, towards God consciousness, towards the higher spiritual realms. But let's not forget that we have physical bodies and we are covered in microbes. So if we start to also grow in that microbial direction, then it means that we can stay grounded and we can have a lasting impact in this age of Aquarius that we're moving into, that we have just moved into. So when we talk about these issues, for me, it all boils down to becoming a better relative. And part of being a better relative is recognizing that we're in relationship to everything else. Everything is in relationship to everything, which means that fundamental to relationships is communication. And that means communicating with humans, viruses, and the rest of nature. So how do we become a better relative? Well, the first thing is to recognize that the rest of nature is also conscious and that you can communicate with it. This could be in the form of conversations, song, movement, dance, with the rest of nature, not just for ourselves, but for them too, with the other than human. And as I've mentioned, if we start to do this by taking steps also in the micro direction, it makes it easier to manage, it makes it incremental and easier to integrate. Such small steps can have a lasting and massive impact, in the same way that we've seen coronavirus have a massive impact even though it's really tiny. So our small actions can also have massive impacts in ways that we might not be able to recognize or even expect or predict. When you start to communicate with the microbial world, the realm, or with any other than human, as humans, and I know I've been guilty of this too, we tend to expect something. We tend to expect that something's going to happen that is meaningful to us. But you might get nothing, at least at first. And it's important to recognize that every single attempt, whether you get anything or not, is still meaningful. It might not be meaningful to you, but it's meaningful nonetheless, especially to the other than human. And the reason I say this is because so much of the other than human world has not been communicated with by humans, at least consciously, for a very long time. So when you start, think of it a bit like communicating with a child that is really shy, or might even be starved of love, might even be traumatized. When you start to first communicate with this child in any way, whether it's verbally or in other ways, you might expect something to happen, but if you are familiar with anybody who's been hurt or is shy, you sometimes have to take some time and actually be consistent, even if the results take longer to yield. In this way, it's an act of, again, eco-socio-cultural repair, starting to make attempts and to reach out no matter what our expectations are. And very often it's when we drop the expectations that the real magic starts to happen. And it's in this way that the ripple effects start to happen as well, in ways that you won't be able to predict and you might not even be aware of or recognize. You might feel isolated in your attempts at doing this, especially because many of us are still not allowed to do this as a group, which is when it's really potent. But nonetheless, all of us have felt isolated and yet affected by small things that happen here and there. And yet, it's working on a micro level that very often starts to have impacts on a macro level. In this way, it starts to become fractal. When we deal with our own ecosystems, working and farming and engaging, communing and communicating with our own farm that is the landscape of our body, both internally and externally, it starts to have impacts in how we relate with others. Others start to see how we do that relating, how we engage. That starts to have even impacts on levels that might even happen on a quantum level that you're not aware of. And so in this way, we become better relatives with all of life, seen and unseen, invisible and invisible. And like I said, if we're consistent with this kind of practice and this way of being, it will yield results. I've met very few people that have not seen results in a relatively short space of time. It's a bit like meditating or going to the gym or eating healthily. You gotta start somewhere. To this end, I want to invite you to start simple. I've mentioned some pretty big things, especially when it came to the challenges and the issues that we face. But like I said, starting simple and starting small is also going to have a massive impact. Let's say, for example, you start with communicating with some aspect of your own immediate microbiome. Let's say you choose to communicate with the microbes that are on your skin, or in your gut, or on your food. You might even take it further to the microbes in your garden, or further afield in the soil where the food that you see is grown, that you eat or don't eat. It might look like you starting to have a chat with the kombucha SCOBY that you have growing in your kitchen, rather than seeing it just as something that feeds your gut microflora and keeps you healthy and strong and brilliant immune system, seeing them as co-creators, not just of your own immunity, but of all of life's immunity. It might look like sitting quietly with the fungi that you see in the forest, rather than thinking about just their potential psychedelic effect on you that might be fun. Actually thinking of them as relatives. Maybe there's something that they want to say to you that could have a more profound impact on you than ingesting it and having a trip, if that's something you do. I'm not recommending that, I'm just saying people do that. And I'm even inviting people in the psychedelic realm to engage in a different way. Maybe there's a song that your gut microbiome wants you to sing. Maybe the soil wants you to dance in a particular way, not just on it, but with it, and for it, and for you. However you choose to communicate with the microbiome is good. As long as you're doing it from a place of love, from your heart, even if it feels clumsy, the point is to start. All of us have to start somewhere. Like I said in the beginning, this is a huge topic. And this is really scratching the surface of something that is so ancient, so massive, and so crucial to our evolution going forward, as well as to the past. This is a way of honoring the past as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. Thank you to Wisdom Hub for giving me the opportunity to share this. And I hope that we can engage further through Wisdom Hub and through Ecofluency to evolve together. Here's to harmony and to thriving of all life, to vitality and vibrancy on all of Earth. Thank you.